an effort to help those in America seeking work. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
First, Mr. President, I want to thank our leader and our assistant leader for their great leadership and for their eloquence here on the floor today, and for correctly stating what the issue is. It's not rules. It's justice. And I'm going to speak about that myself. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Gregory Shanahan and Lemmy Telehoun of my staff be granted floor privileges for the duration of today's proceedings.
Without objection.
Mr. President, 50 years ago today, President Lyndon Johnson came before Congress and spoke these bold words. This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. Lyndon Johnson, as we all know, was born and raised amidst stark poverty in Texas Hill Country, coming of age during the Great Depression. From hard personal experience, he understood how poor schools, empty stomachs, and bad health make a mockery of America's promise of equal opportunity for all. When President Johnson delivered that historic State of the Union address, our nation was enjoying unprecedented post-war prosperity. We had become, in John Kenneth Galbraith's famous words, the affluent society. However, in the midst of this nation of prosperity and plenty, there was also, quote, the other America, as author Michael Harrington called it. Fully 1/5 of our population trapped in poverty. Across Appalachia, in urban ghettos, in large swaths of rural America, millions of American children were being raised in shacks and slums, going to bed hungry, attending grossly substandard schools. Worse, experts describe this poverty as intractable. Experts warn that despite the nation's overall prosperity, poverty was growing more widespread because, as one study put it, the poor were, quote, not part of the economic structure. A then report by the President's Council of Economic Advisors asserted that, quote, future economic growth alone will provide relatively few escapes from poverty, end quote. Economic growth alone, they said, will not solve the issue of poverty. Of course, I must add, it's very much the same today, isn't it, Mr. President? Economic growth alone will provide few escapes from poverty for people today if 95% of income gains are going to the top 1%. And if the rewards of productivity gains go to shareholders and not to the workers. So it was in this context that President Johnson, keep in mind less than 2 months assuming the office, after he assumed the office after the terrible assassination of President Kennedy, it was in this context that he summoned the nation so that the unconditional war on poverty could be waged. For LBJ, this was both an economic challenge and a profound moral challenge. It was about doing justice. In his speech to Congress, he said, very often, a lack of jobs and money is not the cause of poverty, but the symptom. The cause may lie deeper in our failure to give our fellow citizens a fair chance to develop their own capacities, in a lack of education and training, in a lack of medical care and housing, in a lack of decent communities in which to live and bring up their children. President Johnson continued, our chief weapons will be better schools and better health and better homes and better training and better job opportunities to help more Americans, especially young Americans, to escape from squalor and misery and unemployment rolls where other citizens help to carry them. Mr. President, in the months that followed this State of the Union address, President Johnson proposed specific programs to attack poverty and inequality, and he articulated his broader vision for what he called a great society. There's no better place to appreciate the boldness and accomplishment of this era than at the Lyndon Baines Johnson's Library and Museum in Austin, Texas. My favorite part is a room, and I've been there several times, commemorating the Great Society, with plaques and pens, signing pens, all along the wall, listing the incredible array of legislation that President Johnson had passed into law. Listen to these. The Great Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Job Corps, VISTA, Upward Bound, the Food Stamp Program, Legal Services for the Poor, the Community Action Program, Community Health Centers, Head Start, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, Public Broadcasting, the National Mass Transportation Act, the Cigarette Labeling Act, the Clean Air Act, the Wilderness Act. Mr. President, it takes your breath away to think about all that was done. These great society programs have defined the modern United States of America as a compassionate, inclusive society, a genuine opportunity society where everyone can contribute their talents and abilities. Last month, on December the 4th, in his landmark speech on inequality, President Obama noted that these and other initiatives have helped to reduce the poverty rate by 40% since the 1960s. Have helped reduce the poverty rate by 40% since the 1960s. President Obama said, quote, "These endeavors didn't just make us a better country, they reaffirmed that we are a great country." However, Mr. President, on this 50th anniversary of President Johnson's great address to Congress, I must acknowledge that there are some who profoundly disagree with this assessment on the war on poverty and the Great Society. They insist it was a great failure. Indeed, I have heard this claim from many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle since I first came to Congress in 1975. This supposed, quote, failure of the war on poverty, this failure of the Great Society, has indeed become almost an article of faith and dogma among conservatives. It is truly the triumph of belief over reality. As President Reagan said on May 9th, 1983, quote, "The great expansion of government programs that took place under the aegis of the Great Society coincided with an end to economic progress for America's poor people." Wow, that's quite an assertion by President Reagan. So, Mr. President, allow me on this 50th anniversary to take a few minutes to point out many of the, quote, failures of the war on poverty and the Great Society. Perhaps a good place to start is by pointing out the, quote, failure of Medicare. At the bill signing ceremony for the Social Security Amendments Act on July 30th of 1965, President Johnson enrolled former President Harry Truman as the first Medicare beneficiary and presented him with the first Medicare card. You know, these days we talk about life after 65 as the golden years. Well, I'll tell you, life after 65 used to be the nightmare years, with tens of millions of Americans unable to afford even basic medical care, condemned to live out their senior years in the misery of untreated or poorly treated illnesses. In 1959, the poverty rate among older Americans was 35%. Since the Great Society program started, poverty rate among seniors has fallen by nearly 2/3. What a failure. What a failure. And Medicare is especially personal to me. I remember my father, who was then in his late 70s, had never had access to any regular health care in his life. My father only had a sixth-grade education. Worked in coal mines most of his life. Suffered from what they then called coal miner's lung. They always called it coal miner's lung. And he would get sick all the time, and if it weren't for the compassion and the generosity of the Sisters of Mercy, who would take care of him when he got sick and nurse him back to health, I don't know what would have happened to him. But I can remember coming home from the military on military leave, late 1965, and my father had his Medicare card. And for the first time in his life, and now he was approaching almost 80 years of age, for the first time in his life, he could go see a doctor. He could go see a doctor without begging, without taking charity. It gave him the dignity and the security of knowing that he could see a doctor if he needed to. The Great Society also gave birth to community health centers, as long as I'm talking about health care. Community health centers to provide essential medical care to the poor. The first two community health centers were opened in 1964, one in Boston, Massachusetts, and one in rural Mississippi. This model of providing basic health services to the uninsured and underserved was an enormous success. Listen to this. From that modest beginning of two in 1964, community health centers have expanded to include more than 1,200 community health centers in more than 9,000 locations, serving more than 22 million patients annually. What a failure. What a failure. Well, I guess another failure of the Great Society was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We call it ESEA. You know, since Brown versus Board of Education, decision by the Supreme Court in the mid-50s, Americans acknowledged that we had two school systems, one for the middle class and the well-off, and a grossly inferior one for the poor. ESEA said that all children, regardless of their background and their circumstances of birth, can learn, and the federal government will provide resources to help create equity among our schools. Now, educating children of poverty will always be challenging. We still have large achievement gaps that still persist. But Title I assistance to America's neediest schools has made a dramatic difference for the good of millions of low-income children. If it's been such a great failure, I would ask any senator who wants to repeal Title I and defund it, please step forward. Speak up here on the Senate floor. Say that you want to do away with Title I and defund it. I'll bet I don't get any takers. And what about the failure of the Higher Education Act? In 1965, it was rare for young people from disadvantaged and low-income backgrounds to go to college. So President Johnson and Congress passed the Higher Education Act, creating need-based grants and loans with reduced interest rates. Today, Pell Grants, created in a later version of the Higher Education Act, help more than 9 million low-income students gain access to higher education. The Higher Education Act has swung open the doors to college for countless Americans, creating new opportunities and access to the American dream. Again, I suppose some see this as another failure, another government handout that prevents people from standing on their own 2 feet. Well, you can decide for yourself if vastly expanding access to higher education constitutes a failure. But before you do, talk to a lower income student. striving, say, to become a doctor, the first in her family to go to college, thanks to the TRIO program, Upward Bound, thanks to Pell Grants, thanks to low-interest college loans. Ask her if she feels like she's an undeserving taker, unwilling to stand on her own 2 feet. In August of 1964, again, just a few months after declaring the war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Food Stamp Act. Prior to that act, hunger and malnutrition were shockingly widespread in America, especially in rural areas and in our urban ghettos. Now, today, we still have millions of food insecure people in America. But thanks to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the new name for the food stamp program, abject hunger in America is rare. Tens of millions of Americans, more than half of them children, are insured a basic nutritional minimum. Is this another failure? Food stamps? Well, apparently many members of this body think so. In June of 2012, 33 Republican senators voted to block grant the food stamp program and slash the funding by over $300 billion over 10 years. I asked senators who voted for those cuts, have you ever talked to a first grader who was finally able to concentrate in class because she had a breakfast paid for by food stamps? Have you asked her whether she'd prefer to tough it out without a meal to start the day? Mr. President, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson's Office of Economic Opportunity created 269 local legal services offices across the country, providing legal assistance to low-income Americans. This later evolved into the Legal Services Corporation. And as a proud former legal aid lawyer myself, I know firsthand what a difference this can make in so many circumstances. A struggling family facing foreclosure, a battered woman trying to leave an abusive marriage, a senior citizen victimized by a financial scam. I know that without access to an attorney, the poor are often powerless against the injustices that they suffer. Is the dedicated work of legal aid attorneys a failure? I vigorously disagree. And the American Bar Association vigorously disagrees. It strongly supports legal services. You know, every federal judge and Supreme Court justice, in their oath of office, swears to, quote, administer justice without respect to persons, and to do equal right to the poor and to the rich. To do equal right to the poor and to the rich. Well, it's legal services and legal services lawyers who help to translate that ideal into a reality for poor people in courtrooms all over America. Well, Mr. President, our frontline soldiers in the war on poverty are the dedicated professionals and volunteers in community action agencies, another Great Society program. These are funded by the Federal Community Services Block Grant. In 2012, these locally driven agencies served nearly 19 million low-income Americans, including more than 5 million children, more than 2 million people with disabilities, and 2.5 million seniors served by community action agencies. These agencies equip people with skills to return to work. They provide food, clothing, other emergency assistance. They administer Head Start programs, other preschool programs, and do a lot more. So I guess you can decide if the community action program and community action agencies and the community services block grant has been a failure. But before you do, drop in on a community action agency in your state. See for yourself the amazing work they do in relieving poverty and helping people to escape it. Speak to members of a local community action agency board. You'll find that they're local business people, bankers, lawyers, as well as people who receive the services. They will tell you how these agencies do so much with so little, performing indispensable services in their communities. Talk to them. Well, Mr. President, I could spend hours citing so many other great society initiatives. But let me mention just one more. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Prior to that act, African Americans faced open, legalized discrimination and segregation. We had our own American version of apartheid. In many parts of our country, including right here in Washington, D.C., African Americans could not eat at the same lunch counter with whites. They could not use the same bathrooms, the same swimming pools, the same water fountains. They literally were consigned to the back of the bus. Well, because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, those Jim Crow laws and practices were ended in the United States of America. It became illegal to discriminate based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. Well, I guess some apparently call that a failure. One of the great society's many, quote, failures. Well, you can decide for yourself whether America is better off today, whether we're better as a society, stronger as a nation, because we did away with segregation. You decide that. President Reagan, in his State of the Union address in 1988, listen to this. President Reagan, in his State of the Union address in 1988, said that the Great Society, quote, declared war on poverty and poverty won, end quote. One of President Reagan's catchy one-liners. But with all due respect to President Reagan, it simply is not historically accurate. Not even close. From the time President Johnson took office in 1963 until 1970, as the full impact of the Great Society programs began to be felt, the number of Americans living below the poverty line dropped from 22.2% down to 12.6%. Almost cut it in half. The poverty rate for African Americans fell from 55% in 1960 to 27% in 1968. The poverty rate among the elderly, as I said earlier, fell by over two-thirds. Now, the great shame is that this progress, this war on poverty of the Great Society was cut short. The war on poverty gave way to the war in Vietnam. And then it gave way in retrenchment later on, in later administrations, which cared less about giving a hand up to the poor, than about giving handouts to the rich in form of giant tax breaks and other advantages. What was started as a percolate-up economy under the Great Society became a trickle-down economic society under later administrations. So, Mr. President, on this 50th anniversary of President Johnson's great address to Congress, let me state unequivocally and factually, historically factually, the Great Society has been an historic success. However, I must note that 50 years later, our nation confronts a new set of economic challenges, societal challenges, challenges that are every bit as dangerous to our democracy, every bit as daunting and intractable as those confronted by President Johnson and the Congresses of his time. Our economy is still struggling to recover from the Great Recession. The sluggish recovery has left us with chronic unemployment and a middle class in crisis. Social mobility, the ability to work your way up the economic ladder, is now lower in the United States than in Europe. For the vast majority of American workers, incomes have been stagnant for decades. But the rich have grown fabulously richer. Think about this. Since the official end of the Great Recession in 2009, 95% of income gains in the U.S. have gone to the wealthiest 1% in the last 5 years. 95% of income gains have gone to the wealthiest 1%. So, Mr. President, unlike in President Johnson's day, today it's not only the poor who are at risk, our great middle class is endangered. Millions of formerly middle-class Americans have lost their jobs, their homes, their savings, their hopes for a decent retirement. For too many of our citizens, the American dream has become hopelessly out of reach. This is the crisis. This is the challenge of our day. And are we rising to meet this challenge as previous generations of Americans have done? No. I'm afraid we are not. Here inside the Washington bubble, too many of our political leaders have persuaded themselves that the biggest issue of the day is the budget deficit, ignoring chronic unemployment and a struggling economy. This 113th Congress and the previous Congress have pursued policies of relentless austerity, slashing budgets, defunding research and investment, destroying jobs, and even refusing to extend federal unemployment benefits for the long-term jobless, 1.3 million of whom lost their last lifeline of support just 3 days after Christmas. So I am disturbed, Mr. President, by an apparent shift of attitude by many elected leaders toward the ordinary people who do the hard day in and day out work that makes our country strong. I said it before, I say it again, we're seeing an attitude of harshness. You know, we used to agree that if you worked hard and played by the rules, you should be able to earn enough to support your family, keep a roof over your head, put some money away for a rainy day, have a secure retirement. We used to agree that if you lose your job through no fault of your own, especially at a time of chronic unemployment, you should have some support while you're looking for new work. We used to agree on both sides of the aisle that no child in this country should go to bed hungry at night. But in recent years, these fundamental principles and values and agreements have come under attack in our public discourse. For instance, recently on a Sunday talk show, the junior senator from Kentucky said it would be, quote, a disservice to the long-term jobless to extend federal unemployment insurance. I have his exact words right here. Senator Paul said this: when you allow people to be on unemployment insurance for 99 weeks, you're causing them to become part of this perpetual unemployed group in our economy. And while it seems good, it actually does a disservice to the people you're trying to help. When there's 3 people looking for every job, when in some areas, some states, unemployment is even worse than that, you cut off their long-term unemployment, where are they going to get a job? And maybe what the senator doesn't understand is that before you can even get unemployment benefits, you have to be actively looking for work. A disservice? I guess our new attitude is tough luck, you're on your own. If you struggle, even if you face insurmountable challenges, well, it's your own fault, tough luck, you're on your own. If you're a kid born into poverty, or a single parent working for minimum wage, struggling to pay the bills and put food on the table, tough luck. You're on your own. If you're a 55-year-old worker who has lost her job due to outsourcing or technological change, tough luck. You're on your own. If you're a person with a significant disability struggling to find work and independence and dignity, tough luck. You're on your own. Mr. President, there's a harshness among too many in powerful positions toward those Americans who have tough lives, who are ill-educated or marginally employed, or who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. A harshness among too many people in powerful positions toward these Americans. President Johnson would rebuke this harshness and this callousness. As he said in remarks 3 months after his war and poverty speech, listen to what President Johnson said. Quote, God will judge his children not by their prayers and their pretensions, but by their mercy to the poor and their understanding of the weak. I tremble for our people if at the time of our greatest prosperity we turn our back on the moral obligations of our deepest faith. End quote. President Johnson. So today, 50 years later, Mr. President, I remind my colleagues that we are still a nation of great prosperity. We are the wealthiest nation in the world. We are the wealthiest nation ever in the history of the world. Our problem is that this prosperity and wealth is concentrated at the very top. The workers who have created it are not getting their fair share. So on this 50th anniversary of President Johnson's War on Poverty address, I cannot agree with those who say that the budget deficit is our #1 priority. I'm concerned about far more urgent and compelling deficits. The deficits of jobs and opportunity, the deficit of research and investment, the deficit of early education for all our children, the deficit of basic human understanding and empathy for those in the shadows of life. I'm also concerned about the deficit of imagination today in Washington. I'm concerned by our failure to confront today's economic challenges with the boldness and the vision that earlier generations of Americans summoned in times of national challenge. Indeed, our Republican friends reject the very possibility that the federal government can act to spur economic growth and create good middle-class jobs. This is their ideological position, and they're sticking to it. But this flies in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary across our nation's history. You can go back to President Lincoln, who insisted that every American has a, quote, right to rise. To that end, he created the land-grant college system, provided for the Transcontinental Railroad, established the Department of Agriculture with the mission to help farmers boost their production and income and raise their standard of living. President Teddy Roosevelt, who fought for safe workplaces, the 8-hour workday, busting up the trusts that were strangling opportunity for ordinary Americans. Think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who put to work millions of unemployed Americans, including my father, in the Works Project Administration, building roads and dams and bridges and schools, many of which still exist today. Franklin Roosevelt, who created Social Security to end the scourge of poverty and old age. Think of President Eisenhower, who championed investment in our infrastructure, beginning with the interstate highway system, which has expanded commerce and opportunity for nearly 6 decades now. And as we are doing today, let us pay tribute to one of our greatest presidents, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the enormous achievements of his war on poverty and the Great Society. Now, Mr. President, I have not come to the floor today just to look back fondly and nostalgically or to try to correct the record about the achievements of the Great Society. I'm here at the beginning of this legislative year to urge my colleagues to look with fresh eyes at the urgent economic and societal challenges confronting the American people today. We need to think more broadly and with more ambitious vision about how we in Congress can come together to create a greater society, an America of greater opportunity, greater economic mobility, greater fairness. We need to create what I call a new America. Let us dare to imagine a new America where every child has access to quality early learning. Let's dare to imagine public investments to create a truly 21st century infrastructure, modernizing our roads, our bridges, ports, and canals, building high-speed rail systems from Maine to Miami and Seattle to San Diego, a new infrastructure for a new America. Let us dare to imagine retrofitting all of our buildings to make them energy efficient, making wind, solar, geothermal, and other renewables the main sources of our energy. Yes, a renewable energy basis for a new America. Let us dare to imagine doubling our investment in the National Institutes of Health, making possible a real war on cancer and Alzheimer's and other devastating diseases. Think of that. A cancer-free, Alzheimer's-free new America. Let us dare to imagine a true health care system where wellness and prevention and public health are the first priority, keeping people healthy in the first place in this new America. Let us dare to imagine a new retirement system where every worker builds a private pension that can't be touched until they retire, and a stronger Social Security system, solvent, secure, with increased benefits for the next 50 years. Think of it, a secure retirement for every citizen in this new America. These are the big challenges that we in Congress should be addressing. Now, I know by all means there are issues demanding our immediate attention. Again, beginning with the need to extend federal unemployment insurance for long-term jobless. We'll be voting on that motion to proceed here within the hour. As I said earlier, some 1.3 million Americans were cut off just a couple of weeks ago. Another 3.6 million Americans will be cut off over the course of 2014. These benefits are not much, but they make a critical difference for those with no other lifeline. And so this is an immediate concern, and it must be our most immediate priority in these initial days of this session. In addition, the Senate will soon take up my bill to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour and to link it to future cost of living increases. Get this. Since the minimum wage peaked in 1968 as part of the Great Society, it has lost 1/3 of its buying power. So if you were making the minimum wage in 1968 compared to what you're making today, you could buy 1/3 more than you can buy today. Over the decades, the minimum wage has become a poverty wage. Think about it. People go to work every day. They work hard. Sometimes 2 jobs. And they're still below the poverty line. No person in America who puts in a full day's work ought to have an income below the poverty line. Now, these two are the immediate moral and economic issues that we need to address. And I say, yes, moral and economic issues. Today, we do confront huge economic challenges. As Americans, we pride ourselves on our robust free market system. And some say that the unfettered free marketplace will solve all of our problems. Just let it go. They glorified the ideas of Ayn Rand and of academic theorists who say that greed is good, extremes of inequality are necessary, and poverty is deserved. Which reminds me of the words of the philosopher Bertrand Russell nearly a century ago. He said, and I quote, "The modern conservative is engaged in one of man's oldest exercises in moral philosophy. That is, the search for a superior moral justification for selfishness." End quote. And I remind my colleagues that it is precisely the unrestrained, often run-amok free marketplace that has created so many of the problems we face today. Financial and real estate bubbles. And who suffered because of that? Ordinary Americans. Chronic unemployment. Who's suffering? Ordinary Americans. Stagnant wages. Who's suffering? Ordinary Americans. Gaping income inequality. Who's suffering? Not the few at the top. Disappearing pensions. Who's suffering? Ordinary working Americans. On and on. Like a busy highway system, our free marketplace only really works for all when all the players obey essential rules of the road. Rules put in place by government to avoid crashes and bubbles, to rein in wasteful and dishonest money manipulators, and yes, to provide for social and economic justice. And there are some things, big national undertakings, that the private sector simply is not capable of doing. At critical junctures, going back to the beginning of our republic, Congresses and presidents have acted decisively to spur economic growth, foster innovation, help create jobs. And no question, that's where we are falling short today. Members of Congress and elected officials across America can learn from the successes of the war on poverty and the Great Society. We need a new generation of leaders with Lyndon Johnson's passionate commitment to improving education, expanding opportunity, fighting inequality and discrimination. As I said, we need to come together to create a greater society, a new America. We need to act with boldness and vision. The War on Poverty and the Great Society initiatives have defined the modern United States of America as a compassionate, inclusive society, a genuine opportunity society where everyone can contribute their talents and abilities. We see the Great Society all around us today in cleaner air and cleaner water, young people from poor backgrounds attending college, seniors and poor people who have access to decent medical care, people of color exercising their right to vote and to live in the neighborhood of their choice. We see the Great Society in Head Start programs, quality public schools, vocational education programs, college grants and loans, all those rungs on the ladder of opportunity that put the American dream in reach of every citizen, even those from humble, hard-scrabble backgrounds like Lyndon Johnson himself. You might notice I said ladder of opportunity. I didn't say an escalator. I think a lot of times my conservative friends always say, well, we just want to give everything to everybody. Just give it away. Give everybody a free ride. I always talk about the ladder of opportunity with rungs. I don't talk about an escalator. See, an escalator is a free ride. But with a ladder, you still have to exert energy and initiative to get up. But there's one thing necessary. The rungs have to be there on that ladder. Many of them put there by government and society acting together, things like affordable child care programs, early learning, quality public schools, Pell Grants, job training, on and on. They provide those rungs on that ladder. And sometimes people fall off the ladder through no fault of their own. They lose their job. They become disabled. They contract a terrible illness. In those cases, it is the moral duty of government and society, working collectively to provide a hand back up. Things like, yes, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, job training, many others. And you know, up until 1990, we looked around America and we saw that there were some people that no matter how hard they tried could never climb that ladder of opportunity. These were Americans with disabilities. And so what we did in 1990, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, we built a ramp of opportunity, a ramp. And again, we didn't build a moving walkway. That's a free ride. I've often pointed out there's not one nickel, not one dime in the Americans with Disabilities Act that goes to a person with a disability. What we did is we broke down the barriers. We built the ramps, the accessible buses and trains, provided accessible workplaces, widened doors, accessible bathrooms. We broke down the barriers so that people with disabilities could exert their own energy and initiative to get up that ramp. So, Mr. President, like every great leader in our nation's history, Lyndon Baines Johnson brought us a giant step closer to achieving our highest ideals as a people. He fought passionately for social and economic justice for all Americans. He fought to put the American dream within reach of every citizen. And he saw this as a moral imperative. And that's why I consider him one of our greatest presidents. This is the legacy we salute today. This is the lesson we should learn from as we move forward in this country. As we move from this 50th anniversary of President Johnson's great address to Congress, it is this spirit of ambitious public purpose that we should strive to emulate in the legislative year ahead and the legislative years to come. Mr. President, 50 years ago today, Lyndon Johnson spoke to our deepest moral underpinnings. He didn't just couch it in terms of an economic solution. It was justice. It was making sure the American dream really was alive for all. We can't, in our time, become small-minded, looking upon just what is good for today or what are the economics of things. We have to think about it in terms of what our commitment is for moral, economic, social justice for all Americans. As I said, that was the lesson of President Lyndon Johnson. That's what we should take from this 50th anniversary moving ahead. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. The senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, when the history books are written about those who fought hardest against poverty, who stood up for those with no voice, with very little power, in an increasingly unfair economy, LBJ and his war on poverty will be a few chapters in that book, but Senator Tom Harkin will occupy a pretty big place in that story as well, and I salute him for coming down and spending the time to talk about this long fight on poverty that this country has waged until it needs to wage, and salute the role that he has played as just an inspiration to many of us who have sought this office to try to stand in his shoes and in his place. Mr. President, I want to talk about the same subject because over the holidays I had the chance to spend a day in New Haven, Connecticut with a 40-year-old homeless man who up until last spring had been employed for the better part of the last 20 years. But as has happened to millions of Americans over the last several years, this man, who I'll call for today's purposes Nick, lost his job. Now, Nick's had it tough his whole life. His father was a drug addict who got Nick addicted to crack when he was 13 years old. He was born into a cycle of drug use and violence and poverty that's far too prevalent in places like New Haven and Bridgeport and cities across this country. But despite the odds that were stacked against him, Nick graduated from high school. He built a career for himself around sales. And now, after 20 years of working and 40 years of fighting the odds, Nick, for the first time in his life, is homeless. And so I spent the day with Nick, seeking shelter from the cold, using the public library to apply for jobs, attending meetings that have helped keep him clean and sober. And aside from receiving the support that he needs for his health issues, Nick spent most of that day just looking for work. He wants to work. He desperately wants to get back on the job, and he's hopeful that one day he'll find work soon. But he is caught right now in this vicious downward spiral of homelessness. He can't find a job without a home. He fills out dozens of job applications, but with his address being a homeless shelter, he doesn't compete very well with other applicants. But of course, as Nick tells it, how can he get a home without a job? He's caught. He's stuck, like millions of other Americans. Now, one of the things that keeps Nick from starving, other than the food and the shelter that he gets from Columbus House and the local soup kitchen, is the $100 he has gotten, or used to get up until last week, in unemployment insurance. Without that measly $100 a week, things get pretty dire right now as we speak for Nick. But the fact is, well, unemployment benefits make homelessness a little bit more manageable for a guy like Nick. These emergency funds are often the only thing that are standing between a family where their primary breadwinner is out of work and a life on the streets. It's during a long stretch of unemployment where these meager benefits become the only way that a family can continue to pay the mortgage, or the only way that a young guy can continue to keep up with the rent. If we don't restore unemployment benefits now, tens of thousands more people will be living on the streets. That's not hyperbole. That's reality. And they will be then captured in that same catch-22 of homelessness. No job without a home, no home without a job. Now, like Nick, there are 28 million Americans who have needed emergency unemployment compensation since 2008. These Americans aren't some distant, unfamiliar group of people. You know them. They're our friends. They're our neighbors. They're people who have worked their entire lives and who want to get back to work again. I recently sat down with about a half dozen long-term unemployed individuals in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and you see the pain and the agony on their faces as they recount their daily, hours-long quest to find work, applying to hundreds of jobs, making dozens of phone calls, and coming up empty. There's something almost dehumanizing about that effort to seek work, to prove your worth, and to come up empty time after time again. One guy I met, Ronnie, he's sat behind a desk his entire career, worked his entire life in a white-collar job, and he just said that he would take any job. He would sweep floors, to do anything just to get back to work. He's not lazy. He's not gaming the system. He's just one of millions who would rather do any job at all than be unemployed. You know, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they say that they're opposed to extending unemployment benefits because they want to get back to normal with regard to unemployment insurance. But that reasoning just totally ignores the reality of this recession. Unlike the recessions in 1982 and 1991 and 2001, the unemployment rate has not fallen after the end of the recession with respect to people who are long-term unemployed. The rate of those that are unemployed for more than 26 weeks is at the highest today that it has been in 60 years. There are now 3 unemployed workers for every 1 job opening, compared to 2 or fewer workers per job opening in the wake of previous recessions. This just isn't a normal recession. There are more people out of work for longer periods of time than at any time in most of our lives. Now, if you're in the top 10% of earners prior to this recession, things are pretty much back to normal for you. In 2012, the top 10% of earners took about half of all income home in the United States. Let's say that again, 10% of income earners took home half of all the income earned in this country. And guess what? Those people have recovered. And during that time, corporate profits are also at an all-time high. So for those people and for those entities, things are back to normal. And maybe that's why some Republicans think that it's right to bring unemployment insurance back to pre-recession norms. But it's not. One of the hallmarks of this abnormal recession is the amount of people who become unemployed and stay unemployed. 43% of the unemployed people in Connecticut are long-term unemployed. 43% of the people in Connecticut who don't have a job have been out of a job for months and years. Rebecca, who lives in Connecticut, emailed my office and she said, I'm 34 years old. For the first time since I was 16, I'm unemployed. I'm an attorney, and I apply to 20 to 40 jobs per week. Another woman wrote my office, my husband has been out of work for 52 weeks. He spent 30-plus years in banking. His last position was as regional director of retirement services, and now 52 weeks without a job. Frank from Meriden writes, I've worked all my life, 43 years. I was laid off in 2009 and again in 2013. In both instances, I dedicated my unemployed time searching to secure a job. I'd prefer to work as long as I'm capable. And with your assistance in extending the EUC program, I may at least have a fighting chance of securing employment. He says, please afford me the opportunity to continue the employment search without the added burden of discontinued benefits. But we shouldn't only extend benefits because it's the right thing to do. It's also the economically smart thing to do. The Congressional Budget Office tells us that 200,000 jobs are going to be lost this year if we don't restore emergency unemployment benefits. In the week since unemployment benefits lapsed, $400 million has been drained from states' economies. You see, when we give people support during their time of need when they're out of work, they spend that money, and they spend it quickly. Extending unemployment benefits offers the best bang for the buck that you can offer our economy. Every dollar that we put into UI returns as much as $1.90 to the economy. CBO says that by extending unemployment benefits through 2014 will boost the GDP of this nation by 0.2%. One action of this Congress can boost GDP by 0.2%. Now, no matter what we do, it is still going to be a long road back for those who have been unemployed for a year or more, who are going to face discrimination based on their age or based simply on the fact that they've been unemployed for a long period of time. Just giving them benefits doesn't magically put them back to work. But the most remarkable thing that you find when you talk to these individuals is that while they are frustrated, their spirit isn't broken. Every time somebody sheds a tear to me recounting their ordeal of unemployment, their story always ends with a hopefulness that employment is just around the corner. And Nick is that kind of guy, too. He knows that things are going to get better for him. But as we walked around New Haven in the cold for 10 hours last week, we talked virtually the entire time, he wondered whether anybody down here really cared about the dehumanizing existence of being without a job and being without a home. He wondered why Congress would turn their backs on him and the millions of others who have been clobbered by the worst recession in our lifetime. I've kept in touch with Nick in the days since I spent the day with him, and just yesterday he sent me an email. He said, I'm sitting right now in the Department of Labor office updating my resume. Chris, I've not had any luck yet with employment, but I will keep trudging, just as I'm doing in pretty much every aspect of my life. I know it will get better as I continue to strengthen my faith and stay on a straight and narrow path. As long as I continue to do those two things, the sky is the limit for me, Chris. Nick believes that things are going to get better for him. Millions of other Americans who have been out of work for 50, 100 weeks still believe that salvation is around the corner. All they ask is that we extend some modicum of support to them so that they can make that winnowing dream a reality. I yield the floor.
Mr. President. The senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hopefully, later this evening,